been right about almost everything. And now here we are about to talk to him about the police, which he's been saying hasn't been fit for purpose for quite some time. Peter, very good morning to you.
Yeah, good morning. Not sure about that almost, Mike.
Well, there wasn't...
tired of being right, but this is something I've been pursuing for nearly 20 years.
Yes.
Because I did that thing which journalists are supposed to do. I thought, what's going on? I came back from some years abroad, and that it sharpens your eyes for what's been going on in your country. And I thought, it's funny, I seem to remember there used to be police on patrol in this country, and now there aren't any.
Yeah.
Where are they all gone? And I decided to find out why, and indeed whether I was right to think that. And a huge revolution in policing, which began in the 1960s, had in fact come to fruition around about that time. And two things had happened, and they are connected, but not directly. One is that they decided to stop doing the job they were originally formed to do, patrolling the streets to prevent crime and disorder and to reassure the public, and instead to drive around in cars or sit in offices waiting for things to happen, which is an absolute recipe for those things to happen. And as I so often have needed to point out since then, the police cannot unburgle you. They cannot unmug you. They cannot unstab you. A policeman after a crime, unless he's or she is very good at first aid, is actually not much use. The point of them was always to prevent. They gave that up. At the same time, they became increasingly politicized. They were more and more centralized. The small local forces responsive to local needs were merged into great, big, distant forces that nobody had any control over at all. And they became increasingly absorbed by what we would now call politically correct or woke ideas, and less interested in crime. So that it's now become a joke that what I started saying 20 years ago, don't bother asking them about a burglary, don't bother asking them about a robbery, don't bother asking them about disorder in the street near you, because they won't turn up. But if you say something which is politically incorrect, they'll be after you. And so it's people treat this as a joke. But actually, the police officer of now is a paramilitary social worker, because together with this development has gone an enormous increase in the personal powers of police constables and the way they behave. Look at them now. Their belts hanging with pepper sprays, handcuffs, telescopic clubs, who knows what else, and stab vests because they look as if they're terrified, or simultaneously terrified that we're going to attack them and ready to attack us back if we do. And here's a crucial point in the Sarah Everard case, which has been turned, of course, by a largely politically correct media and a political world into a feminist and politically correct issue. It's all about women. Well, of course, I'm as concerned about the dangers of women as anybody else is, and I don't want them to be in danger. But the truth is, anybody could have been subjected to what happened to Sarah Everard. Because what the revolting Cousins did was he used COVID powers to persuade somebody who believed, quite rightly, she was a law-abiding person going about her business, to persuade her that he had the power to detain her. And these immense powers, which the supposed war on terror and the supposed war on COVID have given to individual police officers, which they never previously possessed, have come at the same time as they've become politicized and totally uninterested in serving our concerns. And here's another vital point about this. The police in this country used to be conservative. Look, there's never been and never will be a perfect police force. Such a thing can't exist. There are things bound to be wrong with such bodies. But when the police force was still a more or less conservative body, which was against crime, believed that criminals were bad people rather than people in need of help, and was in general on the side of what you might call conservative morality, it was much more used. This continued. There was a sort of battle in the police force until the Macpherson report and the horrible Stephen Lawrence murder, which was made into the pretext for a politically correct inquisition, in which anybody who held conservative views was pretty much pushed out of line. And then you got the appointment, extraordinary appointment in 2017 of Cressida Dick, whose record as a police officer is, shall we put it mildly, questionable, and was put in office. And the absolute pinnacle of all this, take this comparison. A few years ago, the police force headed by Cressida Dick investigated with zeal and frenzy, with platoons of officers, a completely ludicrous charge made by a mad fantasist who turned out to be a criminal against a field marshal, a decorated field marshal and a national hero. And they investigated, they burst into his life, making it a misery, greatly distressing him and his family. But the same police force could not be bothered to investigate the fact that one of its own officers was known to be an enthusiast for what is called extreme pornography, a drug taker, and for going around without the lower part of his clothing on. This is the contrast. A completely fantastic, baseless claim against Field Marshal Lord Bramall was pursued with vigour and manpower and money, and a serious and dangerous case of a police officer out of control was not pursued at all.
Yes,
and that sums up what's wrong with this outfit.
Well, it really does, because I mean, not only was it a political manoeuvre, that whole business with that operation that Cressida Dick ran, but it was also backed by no less than the deputy leader of the Labour Party, Tom Watson, at the time, who got up in Parliament and demanded the truth be told about all these terrible stories that he had heard from this fantasist. And worse than that, Peter, we learned at the weekend, I think, that 3 weeks before the murder of Sarah Everard, the police were given CCTV footage of Wayne Couzens at the McDonald's drive-through, where he did flash at the woman behind the counter, and they did nothing about it.
Well, of course, this is being made into an issue about feminists, and the truth is they don't do anything about much. And their basic default position is not to respond. They don't respond because they couldn't. And what happens when you become a reactive fire brigade police force is so much crime and disorder then takes place that you cannot conceivably respond to it all. So you start by doing a kind of triage, trying to work out what you will respond to. And then bit by bit, you give it up, and it simply becomes a matter of issuing a crime number and moving on. This is why I say that this police force, which no longer deserves that name, should be replaced, and we should create new police forces, which are genuine local police forces, the kind we used to have. We should advertise for men and women of probity and experience and restraint to staff them, and we should train them in doing the job which Robert Peel originally established the police for, preventive patrol. And when that force is ready, we should disband the existing force and close it down. I think this will become increasingly attractive the more people experience the complete failure of the police of this country to serve them. They no longer serve the people. They serve, to some extent, a very politically correct state, but they don't serve us. And I think that the time has come to say, well, we pay for this.
Yes.
What we want is a police force which serves us again, and that I think I used to say, oh well, yes, there are lots of good officers in the police force, which may well be true, though I think it's less true than it was, say, 20 years ago, when a lot of people who had hung over from the old days were still around. It doesn't matter how nice they are, how kind to animals they are, or anything to do. If they are in an institution which is fundamentally, unreformably bad, then they will not be able to do the job that we pay them for. No doubt some of the people in the existing police could be recruited into the replacement force which I propose. But some, it seems to me, very definitely shouldn't, including people like Wayne Couzens, who should be filtered out. Actually, I think a police force which doesn't have an ironclad rule that nobody is hired with a criminal record is on the way to perdition anyway. And I think that rule was stopped some time ago.
It does seem extraordinary, doesn't it, that you can have a criminal record and work in the police, but you probably couldn't work, for example, where you work. If you had a criminal record, they probably wouldn't employ you. If I was done for some kind of crime, I would probably be fired and shunted out the door quicker than you could say Cressida, you know. But you can work in the police. That's not a problem.
It is an astonishing fact, and when I first learned it, I was amazed that more people weren't shocked by it. But there are some places plainly where you can be flexible and you can say, okay, well that. No. But in the police force, you surely have to say, actually, that is a disqualification. But we haven't for some time, and this is part of the problem. We don't anymore. But this is because we don't anymore think of the police as being, as I say, on the side of what I call conservative morality, believing that certain actions are wrong and should be punished.
Exactly right. And what about Cressida Dick? Because, I mean, with every sort of hammer blow, as it were, she seems to survive and be even more sure of herself. You know, today we find out, or last night we find out, that yet another police officer who was working in the same squad, effectively, in Parliament as Couzens, is on a rape charge. Obviously, we can't talk about that case because, you know, the trial hasn't happened yet. But, I mean, do you think it's time now that she has to go away?
Well, the thing is, it's the kind of force which she heads, this politically correct left-wing police force which she heads, desires her as its ideal leader. if that's the sort of police force you want, you're going to want someone like her. I predicted many, many years ago that she would, when I first heard of her exploits in the Thames Valley Police, as following the nostrums of modern politically correct policing, I predicted that she would become the first woman commissioner. I've got the cutting somewhere. It's extraordinary how long ago it was. That kind of police force requires that kind of leader. I would, of course, like to see her go as a symbolic moment, but the truth is, if you didn't reform the whole police force of which she is the head at the same time, it wouldn't change anything. They would find somebody else who was just the same. And it's the fact that the modern police force is like this and wants somebody who is ultimately a person of the left to run it, that is the problem. The whole idea of policing in this country was devised because of what had happened on the continent, where in the 18th century, police forces had become engines of repression and a machinery of the state, and were much feared and disliked. And the Parliament refused to set one up, even though it was quite high crime in London. They said, we're not risking this because it will be a monstrous body which will eventually become a threat to public liberty and indeed to everything else. And as it turns out, that's what's happened. But in the initial 100 years or so, after setting up police, 150 years really, it wasn't so because of Robert Peel's extremely sensible rules. No flashy uniforms, no obvious weapons carried, limited powers. No police officer really to have any more powers than an ordinary citizen, and patrolling to prevent their prime purpose, to prevent crime and disorder. And that all that's been forgotten. So it doesn't matter. You can get rid of Cressida Dick and replace her with another person who would turn out to be just like her. She's not really the issue.
No, indeed. But there was a sort of certain proportionality as well about the police. When I was growing up, you were kind of respectful of police officers. They were generally speaking quite good at working out what to do in any given situation. If they needed to use force, they would. If they thought that was a wrong idea, they wouldn't. Nowadays, you see video footage, and I know that's often difficult to judge because you don't always see the whole picture, but they seem to be excessively violent when they don't need to be. And then they seem to do nothing when they should. Like, for example, this morning we're hearing that they were standing by at Blackwall Tunnel as the Insulate Britain mob was sitting down blocking it, and they weren't dragging them away.
Well, the old form of policing created a certain type of officer. The old-style patrolling police officer on his own, because they didn't go out in pairs. If they go out in pairs, all they do is walk along together chatting about overtime. They have to go out singly. The individual police officer came to rely on his good relations with the public. He got to know the public. He got to know members of the public who were not criminals and who were not disorderly louts or vandals, and he came to respect them, and they came to like him or her. And as a result, the police had a strong, close relationship with the public, which they have now completely lost. And therefore, the huge gradation of any of us who've ever been in a late night difficulty on a train or something, this knows there's a huge gradation between an altercation and violence, which diplomacy and good sense can overcome. That long area in which experience plays a huge part, a long area of choice of behavior has gone. They go straight into the mode of hostility, and in many cases they never meet anybody among the public who isn't a criminal or a suspect. And they refer, and they deny this, but they refer to us as civilians, as if they were some kind of armed force. They're not. They are themselves as civilians, ordinary citizens in uniform, and they should behave as such. They do a much better job if they did.
And it's interesting because I was given a piece of information over the weekend about Sarah Everard, where she was abducted from, was not far from, just yards away from the former closed, decommissioned Metropolitan Police Station in Cavendish Road. So, how about that for a symbol?
It's another thing. I mean, these abandoned frontier fortresses where the police stations were established in highly populated central areas to give a visible sign that there was a presence of authority in our midst to which you could appeal at any time. In those days, if you went into the police station, there was a desk and a sergeant at it. Now, if you could find a police station and it's open, you find armoured glass, and probably the person behind the armoured glass is not even a police officer. No. All that's gone, but most of the stations have gone. That went at the same time as the foot patrols were abolished. And my book, which I have to plug here, though I say, for heaven's sake, if you don't want to buy it, get it from a library. I don't mind how anybody gets hold of it. Will you please read it? The Abolition of Liberty, which I published in 2004. I pressed that book into the hands of at least one Home Secretary and 2 senior police officers, and I've never got any response at all, though it gives a very, very thorough, rational, factual argument about what's going wrong.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
it implies very strongly what should be done to put it right. No response at all.
No, of course not, because it's not the right response. I mean, they don't want
Well,
to have to respond to common sense, for heaven's sake.
It's just the debate on this is at such a low level, particularly among politicians who say things like, "Bobbies, we'll have more bobbies on the beat." There hasn't been such a thing as a bobby, probably since the 1970s, and there hasn't been a beat either. And anybody who says that instantly reveals himself or herself as not knowing anything about it. And then they say, "Oh, well, you can't do that because we haven't got the numbers anymore."
Yes.
The truth is the numbers of police, both in raw numbers and per head of the population, have gone up hugely since the days when we had foot patrol.
Yeah.
And what's more, the police no longer have to run prosecution. That's been handed over to the CPS, so they might get that back. They're no longer in charge of the security of commercial premises, which has gone to private security firms. They no longer do parking. And as far as I can see, they've completely abandoned anything remotely resembling traffic patrols either. So they've got less to do, and they have tens of thousands of back office non-uniform staff, who they refer to as civilians, working with them, who they also didn't have before. So there is no excuse in terms of numbers or resources for not doing the job which they were originally set up for.
But this is the world in which we now live, Peter, where the soundbite is king. I mean, I've just heard Boris Johnson on the news saying that, you know, they've got a shortage of lorry drivers in China. How does he know that? I don't believe that for a minute. And even if it is true, how would he ever possibly find out that was the case?
Sorry, I mean, nothing anybody tells you about China should be taken as truth unless you've been there personally and verified it.
Yes. Exactly.
Chinese
Speaking of our political landscape, I'm pleased to see you're not having to suffer the slings and arrows of having to go to Manchester to watch Tory.
Oh, I am going to Manchester.
Are you?
This afternoon I've got I'm doing a harangue at a meeting outside the conference. Outside the conference zone, organised by Unheard, about the future or possibly lack of it of the Conservative Party.
Ah, right, okay.
So, no, I am in fact going to Manchester, but I won't be going to that dreadful conference.
No. Well, I'm glad
I'm not
to.
sure I've passed the security test for it.
I shall look out for you on social media. But I was interested in your take on Angela Rayner this week as well, and the smoking business, because it's interesting that, as you say, she's a bit old-fashioned when it comes to showing herself smoking, isn't she?
Well, I'm not sure it was intentional, but it is extraordinary how you're perhaps old enough to remember Harold Wilson.
Yes.
Who used to smoke for political effect.
Yes.
He'd appear on television, and sometimes he'd light his pipe so vigorously the whole studio would fill with thick smoke. You'd barely see him. Actually, he smoked cigars, but he smoked the pipe because he thought it made him more homely. And then Neil Kinnock even smoked a pipe, you may remember.
Yes,
as well.
I do.
So public smoking by politicians used to be normal. And then as the news sunk in that smoking was bad for you, they began to do it secretly. So David Cameron smoked, but no one ever saw it. Barack Obama smoked, but everybody knew this, but you almost never saw a picture of it. And now here's Angela Rayner and Michael Gove, I believe, is also a smoker.
Yes.
People lecture us constantly about our duty to the sacred NHS and the public health. And here they are doing something which everybody knows is fantastically dangerous, and which is certainly alleged to be dangerous to people nearby. And I don't think you can do both. It's one or the other, but not both. You can't be a left-wing politician like Michael Gove or Angela Rayner and smoke. You've got to give one up or the other.
Yes.
Well, I mean, which one they give up.
Well, certainly if you're going to be advising people on their health, I think that's a de rigueur, isn't it? Absolutely.
It's like a very fat person advising people on their diet. Just don't do it.
Yeah, exactly right. Well, Peter, great to talk to you as ever. Thank you very much indeed.